Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Glad you're here. Got a ton to do today. I want to get right to it real quick. The other day, like 2 days ago, in passing, we mentioned Drew Brees and now his multiple apologies. And his wife has now apologized in this Instagram post. And she said, "We are the problem." And she said something like I'm not, like we don't actively look for racism around us or something like that. And I made some comment like, maybe that's the problem, right? Perhaps the opposite is true. That's the theme of our show. Perhaps people are looking, it's not that they're not looking hard enough. Perhaps people are looking too hard for racism around us. And here's just a good example of this, right? It's all over the place, but here's a good example. So the press secretary, McKinney, she called Biden advisor Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Okay, so she called AOC an advisor to Biden. And AOC wrote back this. She said, she wouldn't be the first person to mistake a woman of color for having a lower position or title than she does. But Kaylee, in case you haven't picked up a newspaper in 2 years, I'm a congresswoman. And then she says, the press secretary's comment is steeped in a long, by the way, she called her Biden's advisor. Okay, not peon or some demeaning thing, advisor. But that is steeped in a long, hurtful, and horrendous history of stripping women of color of titles and diminishing them to the help. Perhaps she isn't aware that what she did is mired in racist history. And if that's the case, I look forward to her apology tomorrow. Right? So that would be looking for racism. You get called Biden's advisor, and it's like, oh, that is steeped in racist history. Good night. To which the press secretary wrote back, Kaylee, she said, read the transcript, Congresswoman. That sentence, here's what she actually said. She said, yes, it's a really good question. The president is appalled by the defunded police movement. The fact that you have a sitting Congresswoman wanting to fund the police, notably Rashida Tlaib, Congresswomen, notably Rashida Tlaib, notably Biden advisor AOC, formerly, right? She, in the same sentence, she actually did call her a congresswoman, okay? But it doesn't matter. It's all about being a victim all the time, nonstop. Racism is everywhere. And that's what I want to talk about for a couple segments here, if we can. I want to take some time on this and sit on this because there's this term going around called anti-racist. And we all need to know what this is, because if you're not it, if you don't follow along and say that you're an anti-racist, then you are a racist. You're one or the other. So I want to quote here Andrew Sullivan. He wrote an article back, it was November 15th last year, 2019. So it was before all this kicked up. And he wrote an article called The Intersectional Left's Endgame. So it's the progressive left, the woke, Black Lives Matter crowd. Where's this all going? And he's writing specifically about a super popular book right now. It's probably the second most popular book. The most popular book right now is White Fragility by Robin DeAngelis or D'Angelo. And we quoted that last week. We broke all that down. The second most popular book is Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. So let me quote. This is Andrew Sullivan quoting from the book. Right? Everything in the world, he argues, everything is either racist or anti-racist. This is a quote of his. There's no such thing as a non-racist or race-neutral policy. Inequity is defined as any difference between any ethnic groups in their average outcomes in any field of life or work. Therefore, any policy that leads to any racial differentials in anything, this is a quote from the book, that doesn't roughly reflect the racial demographics of the society is ipso facto racist, okay? So years ago on the radio show, we talked about restorative justice, and the foundation of that is because more students of color are suspended and disciplined than white students. So a rule in a school that says you can't punch a teacher, truly, a rule that says you can't punch your teacher in the face, if that's the rule, and a disproportionate number of black kids versus white kids punch their teacher in the face, that rule is racist. I'm gonna give your brain a second to process that because it's insane. And your brain's like, wait, what? So it is racist to have a rule that says you can't physically attack your teacher because more black kids physically attack their teacher. But black students are like 13% of the population, black people 13, 14%. So even if just more than 13% of the kids who attack their teacher are black, then the rule itself is racist. That's what that is, all right? And that was the beginning of restorative justice. Oh, we need to get rid of that rule. We need to talk about things more. And there's no discipline, and now that's why schools are so super dangerous. And you can see how silly this is, because if that's the standard, if anything that results in a disproportionate outcome for races, then basketball's racist. Is basketball racist? Is the game of basketball racist? Of course not, it's ridiculous. So this guy, by the way, I should have started off with this. This is super popular. He's a big-time professor at American University. He recently earned a Guggenheim Fellowship, right? This is like a big-time academic, super popular guy. And this is an actual quote of his, okay? Wrap your head around this. He says, the most threatening racist movement in America today, it's not the alt-right's desire for like a white ethno-state, right? That's not a thing. He says the actual word he used, most threatening racist movement today is the regular American's drive for a race-neutral society, okay? I told you this last week. Your kids or grandkids, however old you are, your kids or grandkids will not know Martin Luther King Jr. They will not know him. I will be old on my rocking chair and something will come up and I'll be like, oh, well, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. said, and my grandkids will say, who? Who's that? I was like, what are you talking about? Like, you don't know Martin Luther King Jr.? They'll be like, oh, we don't I've never heard of Martin Luther King. We used to have a day. Like, we used to have Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Statues, Martin Luther King Jr. You don't even know who this is. No, they don't know who he is. He will be erased from history. Who was the guy who did the measles vaccine? Remember we did a segment the other day about measles vaccine? What was his name? Maurice Hilleman, all right? Maurice Hilleman, maybe more than any human being ever, has saved more lives than anyone. He came up with like 80% of the vaccines that everyone takes today, like eradicated measles and all these other diseases from the world. He saved more lives than anyone. Never heard of him. Never heard of him. Maurice Hilleman, never heard of him. Just completely erased from history. Same thing with Martin Luther King Jr. First of all, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., that's a big problem, right? Do you ever hear Black Lives Matter people talking about anything Jesus ever said? You ever hear him quoting scripture? Of course not. Martin Luther King Jr.'s message of loving each other, of changing hearts and minds. We'll get to that in a little bit here. No room for that in the Black Lives Matter movement today. But then relevant here, Martin Luther King Jr.'s entire message, other than Jesus and love, is judging people by what? Content of their character. None of those things are compatible today. He will be eliminated from history, I guarantee it. So, where's the line here? So the most threatening racist movement is the regular Americans' drive for a race-neutral one, which is exactly what MLK wanted, right? He also, there's no, this guy, how to be an anti-racist guy, there's no persuasion, there's no dialogue. His actual quote is, an activist produces power and policy change, not mental change, all right? All there is power. This is the leftist mentality today. It's all about power. You either wield it or are controlled by it. And power is one's ability to implement racist or anti-racist policies, because everything is either one or the other, okay? So let's just stop here. Let's stop here, I know this is a lot. You see some of the problems emerging with this mentality? So everything is racist. Nothing can even be neutral. So it's either racist or actively anti-racist. So you gotta be on the lookout all the time for everything. Because everything is either like activisty, anti-racist, or by default, racist. See? So the governor of Kentucky, I haven't really heard any great details about this, but I heard this talk about him giving health care to black residents. Okay? 100% health care for all of Kentucky's black residents. So imagine a scenario where instead we just have everyone's free to work and buy their own healthcare. No, that's racist because some people don't have the same access to jobs, blah, 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 right? So it results in a disproportionate amount of, right? The outcome is disproportionate. Therefore, letting people work and earn their own healthcare, that's racist. You have to actively give healthcare to black people to be anti-racist. See that in action? No word yet on the white folk living in the double wide in Kentucky who are like, wait a second. Not a lot of white privilege here in the trailer park, but they don't get anything. So life is all racist, and it's all about power. What a really sad way to see the world. By the way, my challenging this, me contesting this, this is my white privilege showing. Okay, I'm being defensive about this, and my defensiveness is proof that my power is being threatened. And the racial hierarchy that I've benefited from is being attacked, which is making me defensive, and that proves that this hierarchy exists in the first place. That's the double bind that we're put in. So you must go along with it, which then therefore you're saying it exists. And if you try to criticize their arguments, then well, that's also proof that it exists. Because otherwise, what's the problem, Slater? Why are you being so blah, blah, blah? All right, we'll take a break. I'll tell you next what this book says you need to do in order to be an anti-racist. Because you doing nothing, or even you just being a wonderful person, that's kind of what we talked about last week with white fragility, right? You just being a wonderful person to everyone you know and everyone you see and everyone you love, that's not nearly enough. You need to be an activist on top of that. So what does it mean to be an anti-racist? What do you have to do to be an anti-racist? We'll break that down next. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back. I have a lot more white-splaining to do here, so let's get back to it. So the question is, what does it take to become an anti-racist? Okay, because you're either one or the other. You're either an anti-racist or you're a racist. You don't want to be a racist, so now you got to be an anti-racist. But what does it mean to be an anti-racist? So I'm quoting here from the guy who wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Andrew Sullivan's writing about it as well. So I got two different quotes here, but this is the actual author. He said, in order to be an anti-racist, you need to deploy anti-racist power to compel or drive from power the unsympathetic racist policymakers in order to institute the anti-racist policy. This is Andrew Sullivan. He never gets more specific. Again, it's hard not to notice that there's no room for changing hearts and minds in this worldview. The point is to get and use power. You do not vote racist politicians out of office or persuade others to do so in a liberal democratic process. You compel them or drive them from office with anti-racist power. And one is left to wonder what he could possibly mean by that. So you see it every day, compel or driving from office. I think this round of the movement is over for now. I mean, obviously it's gonna come back. And as we said yesterday, the tactics of shaming in particular are going to stay around with other things too. Right now, it just happened to catch on, glabbed on with race. But anyway, I think this will be over probably by the weekend, I think. Who knows? I think one reason it's over is because starting last night, it really got into silly mode. All right, you see the editor-in-chief of Bon Appetit magazine just left. He resigned his job because a picture came out of him from 16 years ago on Halloween, dressed as like a Puerto Rican baseball player or something like that. Okay, so he had to resign. And once stuff like that starts happening, once these little nitpicky things from decades ago pop up again, I think everyone starts rolling their eyes and it's like, oh, okay, all right. Like I think we're done here. And I think it's a sign that this particular round is running out of steam. But then he had to write this super blowhardy, like, oh, I think he put it like, I'm stepping down to reflect on the work that I need to do as a human being. 16 years ago, he dressed up as a Puerto Rican baseball player, and it's like, oh, I don't know, like I have so much work I need to do. That's so stupid, right? But that's what this is. That's the compelling and the driving people from power who aren't, use some word, like they're unsympathetic racists. Unsympathetic, racist policymakers, right? Crazy. So here's a specific thing that he has suggested. He suggested this how to be an anti-racist guy, suggested that we make a constitutional amendment. Right? So here's his constitutional amendment. It would establish and permanently fund the Department of Anti-Racism, the DOA, comprised of formally trained experts on racism and no political appointees. The DOA would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state, and federal public policies to ensure that they won't yield racial inequity. So that's the you can't punch a teacher in the face policy that we were talking about before, right? So if the rule of the school says you can't punch a teacher in the face, you got to be like, well, hold on, wait a second. We got to run that through the DOA first. What's the DOA say about that? Is this going to result in racial inequity and outcomes? If so, we can't pass that law. So everything's got to be run through the DOA. To monitor those policies, investigate private racist policies when racial inequity surfaces, and monitor public officials for expressions of racist ideas. Oh, good night. The DOA would be empowered with disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers and public officials who do not voluntarily change their racist policy and ideas. Good night. So obviously that's never going to happen in the Constitution, right? But that's the world that they want to create. That's their end game, right? Who are these unelected, formally trained experts on racism? Right? Who are those people? Well, those are going to be the critical race theory college graduates who now go into the real world with this power crusade against all racist everywhere, right? We gotta find all the people who dressed up like a Puerto Rican baseball player 16 years ago on Halloween and get them out of here. Not Klan members. That's why I want to be clear. They're not after Klan members. But if you have a company that doesn't have at least exactly 13% of your employees black, then you're racist. You're racist by lack of your anti-racism. We had restorative justice in our K-12 school system, and we let it fester. And that left K-12 world, and now it's abolished the police. We had silencing of speakers and speeches and college newspaper editorials in colleges, and now it's graduated, and now it's in the New York Times and businesses across the country. And now we have the same thing here. We have college bureaucracies that have been created over these years to police and monitor racism, right, by the words of this guy. And now it's graduated. It used to just be on campuses, these giant bureaucracies, and now it's being proposed for the real world as well. This is Andrew Sullivan. These people are tasked with investigating private racist policies. I don't even know what that is. Any policy change anywhere in the US would have to be pre-cleared by these experts who could use disciplinary tools if policymakers do not cave to their demands. What's a disciplinary tool? What could that possibly mean? Among those policies would be explicitly favoring non-whites over whites, because there's an actual quote. Check out this quote from this guy. This is amazing. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. And the only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. How absolutely contrary is that to Martin Luther King Jr.'s message? Right? He talked all the time about not wanting to enslave or discriminate against the other race. His entire message was entirely about unity. And now the message today is entirely about discriminating. Just rife with bitterness. So I gotta go here because we got other stuff to do. But Andrew Sullivan wrapped up and he said, listen, every now and again, and he wrote this before this latest kick. This was the end of last year. He said, every now and again, it's worth thinking about what the left's ultimate end game is. And the ultimate aim seems to be running the entire country by fiat to purge it of racism and every other intersectionalism and phobia and everything else while they're at it. Oh, real quick, by the way, I saw yesterday, makeup companies for some reason, I don't know why makeup companies, maybe because Kylie Jenner or whatever kind of let it, I don't know. But makeup companies were posting what their racial makeup is of their company, right? So it was like, oh, our company is 20% black, 40% BIPOC, which is a thing now. It's Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC. And then it was like an 80% women identifying. So that was a funny way to put that, right? That's for transgenderness, women identifying. So it's bizarre, right? Like, oh, we didn't do this. We were going to do it today. Darn it. Okay, we got to do it tomorrow. Racism, where race came from, this idea of race. So it's not a scientific thing. Race is a social construct. It's a entirely made up thing about 150 years ago. There's no scientific basis for it whatsoever. It's completely ridiculous. So this social construct, race, today is spoken of in very scientific terms. Like Black, Indigenous, people of color, like broken down in like subcategories, categories and subcategories, even though it's a complete social construct. And the thing that is science, gender, is this like vague, like, oh, gender identify. Right? So you see how it's totally backwards? Absolutely backwards. Anyway, so it's done by fiat to purge society of racism. They demand disciplinary tools by unelected bodies to enforce, in his words, a radical reorientation of our consciousness. And Andrew Sullivan says, yeah, there's a word for this. there's a word for it. It's called totalitarian. So a friend of mine, just yesterday, he texted me, and he said a neighbor came by his house and asked if he wanted to put a Black Lives Matter sign in his front yard. What do you do when your neighbor knocks on your door and says, hey, here's this sign. Can you put this in your front yard? What do you do? There's so much to that message, right? That's so loaded. And even if you're Black Lives Matter, you have to admit that that's a loaded thing right now, right? There's a lot to that. And a sign has no room for nuance, right? So and the person said it's you and 20 of your neighbors, right? So you have the added social pressure on it. So you're pressured to do this sign, to put up the sign that you may not agree with entirely, right? Because of all of it. But if you say no, then you're the only guy on the block without the sign. So everyone else on your block is being anti-racist by putting up the sign. And you, by not putting up the sign, by being neutral, right? You're now the Klan member on the block. You're by default racist. If you're not actively anti-racist, then you are by default racist. Might as well put up a Confederate flag and just no lives matter. Well, I don't even know. Black lives don't matter. You might, right? You might as well, like, honestly, that's the perspective. You're either Black lives matter or Black lives don't matter. So get ready for that. Get ready for that coming to you. Prepare for it. And be aware of the traps that people are trying to put you in. Like, I'll say it right here. Listen to how bad this sounds. I just described to you by the author how to be an anti-racist. I just described to you what an anti-racist is. Based off of everything we just talked about and what this guy writes, I'm not an anti-racist. I want nothing to do with being an anti-racist. But you see how bad that sounds? That's the trap they put you in. If I say I'm not an anti-racist, well, are you racist? No, of course not. But I'm certainly not playing this game that you've set up. Don't play any games you can't win. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, coming up next, we're going to talk to a guest who's going to give us a better perspective on police and police interactions with people and police shootings and stuff like that, which I think will be important to have. So we'll do that coming up in a little bit. But I want to do one last segment here before we do that. Listen, it's worth a reminder. What's a greater force for bad in America? That 70% of Black kids are born to single mothers. 70% of Black kids are born to unmarried parents. Is that a bigger factor in a child's life, and then therefore their eventual adult behavior? Or is a bigger factor institutional racism, which, as we've explained many times before using data, it doesn't apply to Black immigrants or Indian immigrants or Asians. What a weird white supremacy that doesn't apply to Asians, right? You know what I mean? That's odd. But even if you're like, oh, Slater, white supremacists don't hate Asians because we have a unique history with black Americans, blah, blah. First of all, we don't, it's not unique. But why then do black immigrants from the West Indies or African countries have a much higher income and education level and in marriage birth rates and all these other social metrics? Why are immigrants from Africa and the West Indies so much higher than black Americans who are born here? So you tell me white supremacists and the white supremacist system that we have in America is racist towards, and we have racist oppressive systems, racist towards black people from Atlanta, but not black people from Jamaica? That's the argument you're making? That society, like the deep-seated racial hierarchy society, can determine where black people are from? Like, no, it's insane. It's God, culture, family. God, culture, and family. Remove those fail-safes, and all heck will break loose every single time. And then all you're left with is the police. And of course, that's not going to go as well as you want it to. You've heard there's a disproportionate amount of black people in our prisons, which again, it's kind of like a weird standard, because who says everything needs to be proportional other than the guy we were just talking about, how to be an anti-racist guy, right? Everything has to be proportional at all times. But what a funny standard, like Asians are X percentage of the population, therefore the prison population, they must also have the exact same population. Like that's, black Americans are about 14% of the population and commit 52% of homicides in the country. But that's not even really accurate, because it's not like old people aren't and black women really aren't. It's men 15 to 40 who murder, young men 15 to 40. So really, and that's about 25% of the black population. So really it's about 3% of the population is committing around 50% of homicides. Look at that. 3% of the population, black men 15 to 40 years old or so, 3% of the population is committing about 50% of the homicides. What gives? It's God, culture, family. Remove the fail-safes, this is what you get. You know, people blame poverty for crime. And I understand the correlation. It makes sense, right? You look at it and you can see how someone would put a correlation between the two, right? If you're poor, you're more likely to commit crime or something. Or if you're poor, that causes you to commit crime. Like I see it on the surface, but it's not causational. It correlates, but it's not causational. I know a lot of poor people who haven't killed people. I know a lot of poor people who don't commit crime. You may be listening now and you grew up poor. Did you commit crimes? Not necessarily. So it's not poverty. It's got to be more than that. And my argument is that it comes from above, not from below. Theodore Dalrymple. I know we've talked about him a lot lately. He's one of my favorite writers. He wrote a book called Life at the Bottom. He wrote many books, Life at the Bottom. He's a prison psychologist and a psychologist in hospitals and just in the poorest areas of England, which, by the way, all races, mostly white, and it's the same culture, the same broken culture. Here, there, it doesn't matter, race has nothing to do with it. And he tells the story of New Zealand and how New Zealand has one of the highest standards of living in the world. It's a democratic society, very egalitarian, all these things that would lead you to believe that they should be crime-free. There should be no crime in New Zealand, right? But they have super high crime rates. They're as high as England. As high as the mother country. So why? Why does New Zealand have high crime rates? The elites. Ideas have consequences. So here's the story he shares. 1954, there was a big high-profile murder in New Zealand. There was a high school girl. Her parents were separated. Dad lived in England. The mom was going to move back to England. And the girl, high school girl, did not want to leave because she had a girlfriend, right? So it's 1954 and she was a lesbian. She was a lesbian relationship in high school, right? Ooh, very, can't do that, very quick. So the lesbian couple, the two girls in high school, they plotted to do really the sensible thing that anyone would imagine would do, kill her mom. There's more to the crazy story. It's insane. Google Ann Perry, and you can read all about it. It's wild, everything else that happened. But they beat her mom over the head with a brick multiple times. All right, here, I think, do we have a picture of the two girls? So you know we're not making this up. There they are. There's the lovely couple now. Shortly after their sentences, some criminologists, some experts came in and they rewrote the whole story, right? Now, any sane person would look at that and be like, Oh, that's awful. You can't, for any reason, beat your mother over the head and kill her with a brick. All right? End of story. Oh, but we got to get the experts in. We're gonna reimagine the storyline, right? So here's Theodore on one of the on how this happened. By the way, these happen to be two lesbian criminologists in particular who rewrote this storyline. Right? This is Dalrymple. According to the reinterpretation, the Parker Home case was not a brutal and pointless murder, but the natural, inevitable outcome of a grand passion thwarted by narrow-minded social prejudice and intolerance, right? So this lesbian couple, they were the victims. They were the victims of an oppressive society. So of course they needed to kill their mom. If society prevented two lesbian adolescents from acting upon their passion, therefore it was only to be expected that they should have done to death the mother of one of them. The primordial wrongness of bashing people with bricks had vanished altogether. They are believed to have acted upon forbidden desires, the greatest feat of heroism that the progressives of our era could imagine, right? These two people, they're not criminals, they're heroes. A repressive society, their mom was a horrible person. Taking her away from her lesbian lover, how could she? These two girls were acting out upon the frustration that an oppressive society put upon them. They are heroes for doing what they did. Dalrymple says, now, if that storyline were true, now, so you get the storyline, right? You get the reinterpretation and see how that can be applied to everywhere else. Like, oh, these people who are looting, oh, it's just because they're poor. These people who are murdering. Do you know in Chicago on Sunday, 18 people were murdered? 18 people murdered. It's the largest number of murders in Chicago since 1961. And the only reason they say 1961 is because that's as far back as the numbers go. 18 people in one day. So you see the excusing of that. It's like, oh, well, listen, I mean, these people, they're growing up in such difficult circumstances. You can only, it's so repressive, so the white supremacist systems that they're living in, you can only imagine the frustration they would feel. And of course they're going to go on and commit. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Now, to prove that, Dalrymple says, listen, if that were the case, that like the repression of desire was the cause of crime, well, the fact that society has gotten rid of all that repression, right? Right? You can be gay, you can do this, you can do that, you can do all these things. You'd think crime would go down. Who was repressing anyone every night, right? But of course it hasn't. And he says in New Zealand, here's 40 years later, after continued loosening of restraints upon the expression of desire, the number of violent offenses in New Zealand has increased 500 times, and the population has just about doubled. Right? So anyway, here's his conclusion. This is the conclusion of this moral neutrality, which begins with intellectuals, right? So it's the elites who start off thinking this way. This moral neutrality, no such thing as good or bad, who are you to say? Begins with intellectuals, soon diffuses into the rest of society, and provides an absolution in advance for those inclined to act upon their impulses. It acts as a solvent of any remaining restraint. Criminals learn to regard their crimes not as the result of decisions they themselves have taken, but as the vector of abstract and impersonal forces upon which they exert no influence whatsoever. And that is systematic racism. That's white oppression. It's all these abstract and impersonal forces acting upon you. There's Larry Elder, who, there's a great interview with him and Dave Rubin. Larry Elder is one of the reasons why Dave Rubin kind of renounced his liberalism or progressivism. And there's a great interview, you gotta watch it. Larry Elder's like, tell me something, right? Dave Rubin's like, well, white oppression. He's like, give me an example. Come on, give me one. Go. And then he named one like about police or whatever, and Larry Elder just like crushed it. And Larry was like, give me another one. You gave me one, I just demolished that. Give me another one here. Give me one of these white oppressive things that are out there. And obviously he couldn't, right? No one can name it. You can't. You got to keep it abstract like that, because these are the forces that are defining your existence and making your future hopeless. Where of course you can only now commit crime, right? Nothing you ever do is your fault. Nothing is ever the result of decisions or a lifetime of decisions that put you in this situation. Right? It's all just oppression. I gotta go because I want to get to our next guest. There's a whole abolish the police thing, right? conservatives, if I may, be careful in arguing more for police and prisons, right? As like the reaction to that, like we got to abolish the police. Be careful being like, no, the police are amazing. We need more police, right? Be careful of that, although true, because we don't want to forget about the more important things that are upstream of it all. And of course, that's God. We're going in progressive order. It's family, culture, God, I believe, right? The systematic removal of these things is why we're even in this situation in the first place. We've removed these fail-safes, and what's left? Police. Right? But in big picture, stop with this whole white supremacist nation. Every nation on earth has had slavery. The big question is, when people talk about white supremacists, compared to what? Right? Where's there a country in the world where black people are a minority, 14%, and we have a black president? Of the top 100 cities, population-wise, 39 of them have black mayors, and over half of those are black mayors in cities with a minority black population, right? So the argument that we're a racist country, a white supremacist country, perhaps the opposite's true, right? Perhaps not. Is this the most racist country? Maybe we're the least racist. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. One thing we love to do on the show is to try and get a proper perspective on things, because it's getting bombarded and inundated, and it's easy to get manipulated and swayed and not get a full picture. So in order to help us get a more complete picture, Rafael Mangual is here. He is a deputy director at the Manhattan Institute, City Journal, wrote this article called "The Toxic Narrative About Police is Wrong," and provided some really good context here that I think is important. Rafael, how are you, brother?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Man, really good. I'm glad you're here. So if I've learned nothing from COVID, it's that data is really hard to pin down. So I look at data now, even with police stuff, and I'm like, how do we know? What does that mean? What's the definition? Blah, 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 blah. So that being said, how did you do this? How did you get this data, and how are we supposed to look at it?
Yeah. So what I wanted to do was kind of take a step back from the sort of heated inner circle of the debate, so to speak, and get a full sense of what the scope of the police violence problem is, to see whether there actually is a, quote, police violence problem, as opposed to a problem with certain police officers being violent. And I think that's a meaningful distinction to make, and it's one that I thought was an important contribution to the debate, given how heated things have gotten. And so, basically what I did was I ran through the Washington Post data on fatal police shootings. They count about 1,000 police shootings a year for the last 5 years, which is when they started counting their database. And then I wanted to contextualize that number, right? So, for example, how often do police use deadly force outside of actual fatal encounters where the person doesn't die? So I went through some data published by Vice and came up with a really, I think, solid estimate of 3,043 gun discharges by police over the course of a given year. This is based on 2018 data. And, I thought, well, that sounds like a lot, right? That's multiple police shootings a day across the country. But I thought further that data just really needed to be contextualized in light of the size of our national police forces combined, as well as in light of the overall volume of police activity, right? When you consider the fact that in the United States of America, we have almost 700,000 full-time uniform officers working in law enforcement roles, and that those 700,000 officers make almost 10.5 million arrests a year. They have tens millions more public contacts in enforcement settings like traffic stops or pedestrian stops and frisks, that sort of thing. When you start to realize how much activity they generate, you can see that things like deadly force, things like use of force in general, become a smaller and smaller slice of the overall pie of activity. And I think when you actually zoom out for just a second, what you see is that instances of police violence, one, are almost always justified, but two, even if they were, it's an infinitesimally small slice of a very, very, very large pie. And when you properly contextualize those numbers, I don't think that we can fairly say that the institution of policing as a whole can be characterized by out-of-control violence, which is really what the narrative is here, and I think it's unhelpful.
Yeah, there's something like, I'm sort of making these numbers up, but it was like 750 murders. I think this was 2016 in Chicago, and maybe 12 black people killed by police. The talk is, the rhetoric out there is almost as if 750 people were killed by police.
No, that's exactly right.
Right. So now let me play a little devil's advocate here.
Sure.
Let me push back on you, because I'm totally with you, but let me push back. Yes, these are discharges. You're looking at officers firing guns and maybe fatal interactions. But what about the collective over time of rude or disrespectful or maybe even physical interactions that don't get reported for various reasons or whatever, and the collective accumulation of those over all these years? Like, how do you put data and how do you contextualize that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's definitely a difficult question. I will say, though, that the article does go beyond just fatal uses of force and deadly uses of and uses of deadly force. It looks also at uses of non-deadly force. So there was one study I cited in there that looks at 3 police departments that are about mid-sized in the states of North Carolina, Arizona, and Louisiana. And the study looked at 1 million+ calls for service that resulted in 114,000 arrests across those 3 departments. And what they found was that in less than 1% of all of those arrests, no physical force whatsoever. I'm sorry, in less than 1% of all those arrests, physical force was used. In other words, in 99+% of all those arrests, no physical force whatsoever was used. And in 98% of the cases in which physical force was used, there was no discernible injury to the public. Now, I do think that a lot of people will come out of police encounters feeling frustrated and angry. And I think that largely, and with a sense that police are rude. And I don't think that's entirely off base, right? I do think police have a difficult job. I do think that it can be a frustrating job. And I can certainly see how those frustrations will come through in the tone with which they interact with the public. And I think that is a real problem because it does feed this public perception or misperception, so to speak. And it's kind of being more polite, being more respectful, being more informative, more communicative would be a sort of low-cost way to maybe help improve the public image, and I think it's well worthwhile. But we do have some data, right? The Bureau of Justice Statistics surveys cross sections of the American public to get a sense of how many interact with police over the course of a year, how they feel about those interactions, and again, even there, where people are sort of self-reporting their sense of how things went, you get a very small slice of people who are displeased with how that interaction went, and even smaller slice of people who claim that they were, the subject of physical force, and again, only a subset of that slice, which again is even smaller than the slice I just mentioned, self-report that force was unreasonable.
Amazing how our perceptions can be so manipulated. Let me throw this your way. So my neighbor is from England. And he's like, what's up with you guys and your police here? Our police, they don't carry weapons. It's, and by the way, I saw a video the other day of a mob chasing after a bunch of police in London, and the police were running away because they don't, but, so what's the difference between us and them, maybe even culturally, I guess, that makes our police forces different?
No, I think there's definitely a sort of cultural difference, between and among our populations that's meaningful here, and it's actually, I think it's quite clearly illustrated by just the differing levels of violence. And it's really interesting to me, right? Because the left has actually been pretty good at leveling this critique, comparing us with Western European democracies within the context of criminal justice debates, right? We'll say, well, America has, 5% of the world's population, 25% of the prison population. Our police, use deadly force exponentially more often than police use deadly force in a country like England and Wales. What's really interesting to me is that they leave out the major differences in, say, gun violence and concentrated homicide, which are differences that actually inform those other 2 enforcement outcomes, right? And this is something that they're really good about pointing out in, say, the context of the gun control debate, right? They'll be very willing to recognize that, for example, the United States has a much higher murder rate than that of England and Wales. But the real disparity lies in the fact that we have concentrated pockets of violence here that are going to require the kind of police response that does result in those pretty serious enforcement outcomes that just don't exist in England and Wales. And I'll give you a couple quick examples. Right, in the city of Chicago, there are just 4 community areas: Austin, East and West Garfield Park, and Humboldt Park. Those community areas had about 121 murders in 2018. If you add just 2 police precincts in the city of Baltimore, the Western and Southwestern police districts, you get 100 murders. Those 2 subsets of 2 American cities have a population that's about 0.5% of the population of the entirety of England and Wales, but they see 30% of the homicides seen in the entirety of England and Wales. And the reality is that when you have concentrated pockets of homicide like that in American cities the way we do, there's going to be a major difference in, say, the use of the rates of use of police force, the rates of incarceration. And I think it's a bit dishonest to just kind of look at those international comparisons in the vacuum without kind of controlling for these other really meaningful variables that take us a really long way.
Oh, man, so good. I gotta go. Real quick. Heard the argument the other day from a cop that said the 3rd leading cause of death in America that no one ever talks about is medical mistakes. All right, so it's heart disease, cancer, medical mistakes, 250,000 deaths a year. And then respiratory illness is number 4. And usually these lists, they leave that one out totally. They don't even list it as a cause of death. And the argument is, well, doctors have a very difficult job and people understand the stress and the circumstances and whatever. And he was making a similar argument with the cops. Very, very briefly, is that a fair kind of thing to look at?
Yeah, no, I think, look, these are very difficult circumstances where people are being forced to make, life and death decisions in the snap of a finger. And of course, like with any human endeavor, police are imperfect and they're going to get it wrong sometimes. I don't think it's fair to read into each one of those instances a level of malevolence that we would never read into, say, the data in medical deaths.
Yes, really good. All right, Rafael Mengua from Manhattan Institute, Deputy Director, and then City Journal. This article is "The Toxic Narrative About Police is Wrong" for more of the data and the sources and all that. Rafael, let's definitely talk again, man. Thanks for all your work.
It would be my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Appreciate you, man. Is that the end of the show? We're done? We'll do it again tomorrow. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word.